Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to look at the origin of the Mexican from a historical aspect. So right here we have the words from Carlos Huervo Marquez, an ethologist, botanist, military general, and historian. He said that the Negro type is seen in the most ancient Mexican sculpture. The Negroes figure frequently in the most remote traditions of some American pueblos. It is to this race doubtlessly belongs the most ancient skeleton, distinct from the red American race, which have been found in various places from Bolivia to Mexico. So those skeletons, those Negro skeletons, have been found from Bolivia to Mexico. And it says it is likely that, we repeat, America was a Negro continent. So that would mean at one point in time, the area that this man presided in before 1858 when he was born, sometime before then, that whole place was inhabited by the Negro type. So we're going to be looking into how basically the inhabitants transformed from the Negro type to the Mongoloid / Spanish type. And as a key correlation to start it off, there's a couple of sentences in this book from 1844 called An Inquiry into the Distinctive Characteristics of the Aboriginal Race of America by Sam Morton. And in it, he says it is chiefly his intention to produce a few of the more strikingly characteristic traits of the American Indians to sustain the position that all the American nations, except the Eskimo, are of one race. And again, down here, he says that the Fuegians, the Indians of the tropical plains, also those that inhabit the areas in the regions west of the Rocky Mountains, those of the Great Valley of the Mississippi, all share and resemble the same characteristics, though in an exaggerated degree. But those characteristics skirt the Eskimo on the north. So basically, in this episode, we're going to figure out how the Eskimos got from the north all the way down south. So to start this thing off, we got to go look at Hernan Cortés. And it says, arriving on the continent, Cortés executed a successful strategy of allying with some indigenous people against others. So it was already in his mind to set one group of Indians against another. On the way to Techocan, Cortés made alliances with indigenous peoples such as Totonacs of Kampala and the Nohawas of Texcala. The Otomis initially, and then the Texcalans, fought with the Spanish in a series of 3 battles from the 2nd to the 5th of September of 1519. And at one point, Diaz remarked, "They surrounded us on every side." After Cortés continued to release prisoners with messages of peace, and realizing the Spanish were enemies of Montezuma, Quetzalcoatl the Elder and Mixcoatzin persuaded the Texarcan war leader Sezocan the Younger that it would be better to ally with the newcomers than to kill them. So Indians could have killed the Spaniards, but their bigger enemy in their mind was Montezuma and the Aztecs. So even though Cortés and these other Indians went over there and basically conquered the Aztecs, what was left was still a bunch of Indians. So from here, I'll go through a few more of the wars just to show you how Indians were played against each other. And then afterwards, Europeans would claim their pieces of territory. So going over to the 1750s at the French and Indian War, we're going to just look at who was involved right here. So in the 1750s, Europeans were still trying to get their pieces of land in North America. So right here, you had Great Britain and the British America with the Iroquois Confederation, which is New York, the Wyandots of Ohio, which is to the left of New York. And then you had the Wabanaki Confederacy fighting with the French, which Wabanaki, that is Maine. So you got the Indians of the state of Maine fighting the Indians of the state of New York. And that happened from 1754 to 1763. And then in 1763, you had what was called the Pontiac's War, where the Indians in New York that were fighting with the British against the French and the state of Maine Indians now were fighting against the British. If you look at a lot of these tribes, Delaware, Shawnees, the Ottawas, Herons, Potawatomis, these tribes are like south of the Great Lakes, Ohio, New York, right here, the Mingos. But then you had the Wyandots also, who had just fought on the side of the British. So Iroquois and the Wyandots right here ended the war in 1763 and then immediately began to fight against this very people that they were just fighting with in Pontiac's war right here. So it doesn't make any sense. But then after this war, you had the Revolutionary War, where they tell us the British and the United States fought against each other. But if you look closely, the United States had on its side France and Spain. Then over here you had Great Britain. So in the Revolutionary War, you have the Shawnees and the Senecas fighting with the British against America. But a decade or 8 years before this, 8 or 9 years before the Revolutionary War started, you had the Shawnees and the Senecas fighting against Britain. So basically, all this means is that they always pit Indians on Indians until the numbers end low. So the way I look at this is that in the French and Indian War, the Europeans got control of Maine, the state of Maine. Then in the Pontiac's War, they got control of New York. And then the results of the American Revolutionary War, they got the whole area of New England, starting with Massachusetts, when the Wampanoag and Crispus Attucks and 300 to 400 other Indians crowded the British. So just like in previous videos I talked about where in the Civil War, it was not a white on white thing. It was a European invading the rest of Indian territory thing. And that's the same thing as these other wars is concerned. It's the same exact thing. They'll tell the story of a British fighting an American and this and that because they've written out Indians from history. But inside of this last war right here, they had something what was called the Articles of Confederation, which I believe was written in 1777 in the midst of the war. Says that the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union was an agreement among the 13 original states of the United States of America that served as its first constitution. Says the document provided clearly written rules for how the states' League of Friendship would be organized. See, League of Friendship. During the ratification process, the Congress looked to the articles for guidance as it conducted business, directing the war effort, conducting diplomacy with foreign states, addressing territorial issues, and dealing with the Native American relations. So understand the concept of this, okay? It all stems back from them deciding to take over this land from the Indians. So after the American Revolutionary War, the League of Friendship in 1789, the government under the Articles was replaced with the federal government under the Constitution. Says the new Constitution provided for a much stronger federal government by establishing a chief executive, the president, courts, and taxing powers. But we're going to go down and look at the accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. So it says, nevertheless, the Confederation Congress did take two actions with long-lasting impact. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and Northwest Ordinance created territorial government, set up protocols for the admission of new states and the division of land into useful units, and set aside land in each township for public use. It says the Northwest Ordinance enacted July 13, 1787 was an organic act of the Congress of the Confederation of the United States. It created the Northwest Territory, the first organized territory of the United States. So if you look right here, it involves basically all these states right here in the black, particularly Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. So if you look right here, they accomplished a lot of this, the whole of New England inside of those wars. So basically, right around this time when the government under the Articles was replaced with the federal government in 1789, right around that time is when the whole of basically the Western Hemisphere was divided up. So we're dealing with how Eskimos got down to the area of Mexico. We have to look at Canada and the Spain relations. The history says that in July 1774, Spanish naval officer Juan Jose Perez Hernandez was the first European to encounter the archipelago of Haiti Gui, formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Island, while on his way to Alaska. After the initial voyage, several other Spanish voyages were to take place along the British Columbia coast. In 1789, Spain created two settlements in Santa Cruz de Nauca and Fort San Miguel, both located in Nacta Sound. So in 1774, the Spanish took control of Nacta Sound. when you look up some images of Nocta Sound indigenous people, this is what comes up. These people right here. Now, as far as what we know about the Eskimos in Canada is that they're from Southeast Siberia and that they have exaggerated features due to polarization. Nocta Sound is right over here. But I looked up the indigenous people from Greenland to give it sort of an example of how the polarization can exaggerate the features. So here I'm about to go into the images of indigenous people of Greenland. This is how they look. Now, can you see how these look like Mexicans? You can see the eyes, how the Asian is in the eyes, but the cheekbones are exaggerated because of the snow. Going back over here to Nocta Sound in the Pacific coast of Canada, there's another American Indian indigenous right here. As you look at the eyes, you can see the Asian and also the cheekbones of the polarization. To get a better understanding a little bit, we can go to Spanish Canadians Wikipedia page and look at the history. It says Spain had land claims to all of Canada since Christopher Columbus. But basically it says that it was Juan Perez who completed the first documented voyage, which took place in 1774. But if you look over here, it gives a little map. It says areas of Alaska and British Columbia explored by Spanish explorers. And right here, it's all up and down the coast of the west coast of Canada up to Alaska. However, if I stop to look right here, it says that people from northwestern Spain, known as Basques, have been landing in Newfoundland, which is a large island off the east coast of the North American mainland and the most populous part of the Canadian province of Newfoundland, since the late 14th century to dry their codfish, which they caught in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. So the Spanish have been going up by Greenland around these people since the 1300s. Now, when you go look at a map of New Spain, you'll see that the little islands up there in Canada that the Eskimos were at were brought down through this channel right here. That's why most of the so-called Mexicans that speak Spanish, which their ancestors were speaking Spanish in Canada because the Spain was up there colonizing hundreds of years ago. But that's why you see a lot of so-called Mexicans in Texas, Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington, like this. And you see less in states like Idaho, Utah, Missouri, Wisconsin, South Dakota. Now, it should also be noted that there was something called the Nocta crisis where Spain and British almost went to war up there. But a guy named Jose Martinez abandoned Nocta and took the captured ships and prisoners to San Blas, New Spain. San Blas is down there on the west coast of Mexico. So presumably that is when Spain started to take over a lot of areas down in Mexico and bring down Spanish-speaking Eskimos. The Spaniards did not bring down Spanish-speaking Eskimos from Canada down into the lands of the Aboriginal American Indians without a fight. That's why they called them warriors, because you can't say it without saying the word war first. They were always at war. But when you go back on the Wikipedia page on the Spanish Canadians, it talks about the Spanish population in Canada being insignificant in comparison to the Spanish-speaking Latin American Canadian community. Says the largest Latin American immigrant groups in Canada are Mexican Canadians. So they had Mexicans in Canada for a long time and in great numbers. And earlier in the video, I showed where there was an issue in Nocta Sound in 1789. Martinez, the Spanish military guy there, took a bunch of people in the ships that he took from the British down to St. Blas. St. Blas is on the west coast of Mexico. Another place on the west coast of California is Santa Cruz, which it says right here was incorporated in 1866 after the California Indian Wars. but it had a mission there in 1791, 2 years after the Spanish left Noctis Sound going south. They started a mission in California called Santa Cruz in 1791. So in the late 1700s, basically the whole of the Western Hemisphere was split up between European countries. You had New Spain, New France, New England. The British had some land up here. The Portuguese had Brazil. And that's how it went. But you had a lot of fighting that had to take place after all this land was split up. Now we'll go look at Santa Cruz, New Mexico for an example. And it says in 1540, the Santa Cruz area was inhabited by Tawa speakers, Puebloians, formerly referred to as Anasazi. And after Vargas' reconquest of 1692 and 1696 by Southern Tawa, who had been relocated from the Galastio Basin 45 miles south as a result of Vargas's Spanish repopulation efforts on behalf of the Spanish crown. So in 1696, the Spanish crown had a program where they were repopulating, taking people 50 miles away and then replacing the area with Canadian Mexicans. It goes on to say that among the best reference materials for this history is the Pueblo Indian Revolt of 1696 and the Franciscan missions in New Mexico. So once again, they did not exercise their repopulation efforts without a fight from the American Indians. Now, to get a better idea of how things went after the late 1700s, you have to go to the list of Indian massacres. Right here it says that in 1782, during the Revolution, Pennsylvania militiamen massacred nearly 100 non-combatant Christian Lenape, mostly women and children. They killed and scalped all but 2 young boys. So that'll give an indication that the so-called Revolutionary War was not fought between British and the other British who branched off. But as you go down the line, you see that in Ohio, 14 settlers were killed by an Indian war party. And then in 1791, at present day Fort Recovery, Ohio, an army of 1,500 Americans led by Arthur St. Clair were ambushed by an army of Miami Indians led by Chief Little Turtle. Then in 1805, Spanish soldiers led by Antonio Norbana massacred 115 Navajo Indians, mostly women, children, and old men. So if we look back at the map, you had the Spanish trying to settle over here in California and down on the west coast of Mexico. And you might think that the Spanish were already here due to them coming in the 1500s, but a lot of those Spanish were engulfed by the Indian culture that was already existing there. So they would, like a Spanish man would get a Indian woman and they would have kids, and the kids would speak the Indian language, like the Nahuatl language down there in the Olmec area of Mexico. Over 1 million people speak that language. But I brought this map up so we can look at this and see how things went. So the Spanish were in Arizona fighting Indians in the early 1800s. You had the 1811 so-called slave revolt in Louisiana, where it was Indians fighting Europeans. You had the War of 1812, which we can go back and look at the list of massacres and see that during the War of 1812, Indians allied with the British killed American soldiers and settlers evacuating Fort Dearborn. So Indians were going at it with the invaders. They say they were allied with the British, but I doubt that very seriously. That was in Illinois. In Indiana, 24 settlers during the War of 1812, including 15 children, were massacred by a war party of Native Americans. In Kentucky, during the War of 1812, Indians allied with the British killed between 30 and 60 Kentucky militia after their surrender. So we go back on the map right here. We see Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, all this part right here. They had already got New England during the Revolutionary War, so-called. Now they had to get basically these states around the Great Lakes, and they accomplished that in the War of 1812. They did not get the state of Kentucky, though, because it was not taken over by Europeans invaders until after the Civil War. So moving along, you had the so-called father of Texas in 1823 massacring Indians down here in Texas in 1823. And then in 1837, you had so-called Mexican colonists under Jose Maria Amador captured an entire rancheria of friendly Miawok Indians in Northern California. That was in 1837. And you go on down the list and you see a lot of California and Texas because they were becoming states. They became states in like 1845 and 1850. So you had a bunch of massacres take place beforehand. That's pretty much how the whole of the Western Hemisphere became what it is today, by through a bunch of massacres, mostly upon American Indians. But looking back on this map, right here in Washington and in Oregon and Northern California, there was a major wars going on in the 1850s. And after that, there was a bunch of war going on over here in this New France area in South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, and all this, in what was called the Lakota Wars, which lasted from like the 1850s to the 1900s or something like that. So that is why when Spanish people were bringing Eskimos down south, they weren't going this way, because a bunch of Indians were already over here. And they were able to bring them through this way because the Umatilla Indian Wars right here were over in the 1850s. So they was able to bring them down. Just like a bunch of Indians were massacred in California by the 1850s, which made room for them. Also, they had small little missions already set up, which basically played the role as their bases when the wartime commenced. At some point, this part of the United States became the United States, and there were a bunch of Canadian Mexicans or Spanish-speaking Eskimos still in the areas of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Nevada, which brought about the 1920 mass repatriation of Mexicans to Mexico across the border. It says the Mexican repatriation. The Mexican repatriation was a mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans from the United States between 1929 and 1936. Estimates on how many were repatriated range from 400,000 to 2 million. So that is how a bunch of Spanish-speaking Eskimos got south of the border. And right here it's showing you where a bunch of those so-called 2 million, but it's of upwards of 4 million, came from. They came from right here on this map, from Oregon, parts of Idaho, Washington, California, all right here in this area, Texas. Sort of looks something just like this New Spain outline right here from the 1819. So I just wanted to put a little something together. I know we're being attacked by these so-called Mexicans who's claiming to be the Choctaws, the Olmecs, any and every original American Indian tribe there was here. They're claiming it, practicing fraudulent activities. So this whole video is to show that the Spanish-speaking Eskimos came from somewhere, and where they come from is up north, like Sam Morton said. Through the history books, which has all been a lie, so therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?